Books group. So I'm very flattered to have been invited to talk to the group as a whole. And I hope that this will be fun and everything for everybody. I figured that since you're all writers and you know as much or more than I do about the mechanics of the process, so I'm not really going to talk too much about that. So I was just going to sort of go through my experience of sort of the ingredients that I put together for this particular story and what I thought about and how I put it together, to put together this little book called Opulence, Kansas. It is a YA novel with a teenage girl named Katie Myrdal as the main character. And she is a daughter of a wealthy family living in downtown Chicago, and then a family tragedy upends her life, and she ends up spending the summer with her aunt and uncle in a small town in central Kansas called Opulence. So that's basically the setting for the story itself. As far as how I started to put it together, let's see if I can get to my next slide. Hello. It wants to do, whoops. Oh, that's not what it wants to do. It wants to do this. There we go. And I don't, there we go. Okay. No. Sorry, folks. Let me stop this and redo it. I want to back up here. Anybody know how I back this up? I don't.
Can you just try the arrow keys on your keyboard?
Oh, that's a good idea. Nope, that's not doing it. Let's try backspace. Nope, that's not doing it either. Shoot. Well, okay, we'll go on from here if we can. The first slide that I was going to show you was the St. Peter and Paul Catholic Church, which is northwest of Ellenwood, Kansas, which was a lovely little 19th century brick church. And in 2007, the huge tornado that ripped through Kansas and flattened much of the town of Greensburg also took off the steeple of this church. And that church is about 6 miles from the house that we subsequently bought. And we've been driving by it ever since, over and over, and we have watched the restoration process, which is done, the steeple's back on. And so that incident was just something that I sort of filed away. A couple of years later, you may remember reading about the Bernie Madoff scandal, and he was this high-flying financier in New York and Florida, and who swindled a lot of people out of many billions of dollars running a huge Ponzi scheme, which basically involved taking money from people allegedly to invest for them, and instead he used it to pay off other people he was supposed to be investing for, until the whole thing came crashing down. At the exact same time, I was reading Charles Dickens's Little Dorrit, which you may wonder what those things might possibly have in common. And if you're not a Dickens nut like I am, there's a character in Little Dorrit who is also a very wealthy businessman who is swindling people for a very long time. And his name happened to be Mr. Myrdal, the character in Little Dorrit. So Bernie Madoff went to jail with a 150-year sentence. He is still there. And Mr. Myrdal in Little Dorrit killed himself rather than face the consequences of his theft. So that was another little drama and story that I thought, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I could use that sometime. And I don't seem to be able to make these slides do anything, which is very unfortunate. Let me try going down here. Nope. All right, maybe we'll do it this way. At least I've got some control over it here. All right. Sorry, this went a lot better the first time around. Okay. The next year, in 2010, we bought our Kansas house outside of Ellenwood, as I say. It is a tall yellow house surrounded by scraggly elm trees with, you can maybe just make out the little red metal lawn chair that sits in the front yard there. And for those of you who have already read Opulence, you may recognize that as the aunt and uncle Len and Maggie. That's their house. And that is the house where my character Katie spends the summer. And that's where I wrote a good deal of this story. We bought this house. I currently still live in Lyons, Illinois, a Chicago area suburb, and we bought this house in 2010, and we will hopefully be settling there permanently very soon. It's just been a long process. Again, for those of you who may already read Opulence, you will know that there are chickens, and hope that is certainly on my agenda when we get settled there is to have chickens. And I was delighted just this last time to discover that we have a family of 5 barn owls living in our barn, which is really cool to watch in the evenings. I hope they won't eat the chickens, but they're pretty good about just sticking with the mice. So that's part of the setting of the story. After that, I ran across in 2012 a book called Prairie Fever by Peter Pagnamenta, which was some aspects of Kansas history. And there was a great story in there about the community of Runnymede, which used to be southwest of Wichita. And it was this community that was created by a real estate developer at the time in the late 1800s. And he was going to put together a little British colony, and he wanted to attract the younger sons of wealthy English families to come and settle in this little community, because they probably weren't going to be able to inherit their estate because their older brothers would. But they were going to have this little English enclave where they could go fox hunting and play polo and go to the opera and have some nice theaters and some nice restaurants and things. And they came, and it lasted about 5 years, and then the whole thing fell apart. The town is completely gone. It's just fields now. I believe a couple of the buildings, I think the church got moved over into Harper. But it was this funny little upsurge for the British aristocracy, and it just fell apart. Then as we were getting acquainted with Ellenwood, we discovered the tunnels that run underneath the main streets of Ellenwood that have been there for many, many years. And there used to be little businesses that ran out of these underground tunnels. You can still go down and visit them. There's the remains of a harness shop and a bath shop and a barber shop, and there were just these little businesses kind of operating under there, which was quirky and interesting. And a couple years after that, there was quite a bit of to-do about the old opera house that had been in downtown Great Bend, and it was an old building and it was structurally unsafe, and were they going to just restore it or save it, and they finally just tore it down. But I thought these little stories kind of helped me put together the setting of Opulence, Kansas, and create this small town with this interesting, quirky little history as a setting for the story. That works. A couple of other sort of random little ingredients. My husband has this wonderful 19th century pocket watch that came down through his father's side of the family, and I researched it and learned about its history and the manufacturer, and it belonged to a forebear of his who happened to be at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. one night in April 1865. And family lore and some of the local news coverage of the time identifies that he may have been the 5th man who helped carry Abraham Lincoln across the street. And we don't know that pocket watch was in his pocket that night, but it's possible. And it's just kind of a neat story that we treasure in the family. In the course of our travels back and forth between the Chicago area and Kansas, we saw the billboards on I-70 for the Cozy Inn hamburger joint, which kind of reminded me of a little hamburger place we used to go to when I was a kid in Michigan. And it looked great, and we said, oh, we really have to go and try that sometime. So that was another little bit that I tucked away. And of course, the Kansas skies. When we're there, we go out almost every evening just to watch the sunsets, and we just marvel at how there's just really nothing like those Kansas skies. And that's a theme that runs through the story as well. So yeah, I'm thinking there's a story I'd like to write in all of these bits and pieces. I'm not a city girl. I grew up in Michigan with horses and goats and dogs and things like that. I was lucky enough, I found a partner who was really into camping and hiking in the outdoors, and that's basically how we've spent our vacations for many years. We used to go out to Colorado and camp up in the mountains, and then one day, a year or so after I started getting into bird watching, I was looking at the map when we still had paper Rand McNally road atlases, and there were these little blue blobs on either side of Great Bend that turned out to be wildlife refuges, and we said, oh, let's go check this out. And we stayed an extra day, and on the way back, we stayed an extra day, and after a while, we just quit going to Colorado altogether and stayed in Kansas. And we just fell in love with it. Just the space and the quiet and the birds, and we just said, this is where we want to settle. This just felt like peace and home to us. And so I wanted to get sort of at that idea of falling in love with a place. I thought, the one model for doing that in a story is the sort of the fish out of water trope, which, you take someone and you plunk them down into an unfamiliar environment and watch what happens and what do they see and how do they cope and what do they learn, and get that experience into it. So that part of my own experience is definitely in Opulence. I do have some things in common with Katie, the protagonist. I was a sort of a book reading teenager who was totally not in the social world. I do take photographs as Katie does. Another theme that comes out in the book is a passion for old musicals. I credit my younger sister for that. She was the one that was nuts for that. So that's another theme that comes out into the story. In other respects, I have never lived in downtown Chicago, but I've lived in this area for a long time. And so those are the bits and pieces that I used to try to create this story. And I tried to weave in some of the values of, urban versus rural, wealth versus working class, possessions and stuff versus relationships. The idea of time, how you use it, how it runs out on you sometimes. Just a lot of ideas that kind of floated through that I worked to weave into the story. One of the questions that came up from people as they started to look at the story was, how did I decide to make this a YA novel? And all I can say is because it just sort of felt like the right platform. The issues that I looked at in it of, loss and change and growing up and falling in love and learning about new places and people just seem congruent with that theme of coming of age and adolescence. So that's kind of how it evolved into being that kind of a story. I don't consider myself a YA writer. YA wasn't even a genre when I was a YA. Back when I was a teenager, and I'm dating myself here, of course, it seemed like most of the youth novels involved, football players and high school cheerleaders, and that was pretty much it. You had youth books and you had adult books, and on the youth side, people didn't really address any kind of, serious themes about, drinking or sexuality or social justice or any of those kinds of things. And of course, that's really changed a lot. I am a librarian by profession. I'm a medical librarian. I don't work in the public sector, but I'm, part of that community. And I went to a webinar from some teen and youth specialist librarians in the Illinois State Library System where I work. And, they talked about identifying the different kinds of readers among teens, the ones that, I've read the Twilight Saga 17 times and that's all I ever want to read. And the kids who just rather play video games, they think reading is boring, and trying to find literature that will appeal to that kind of a range of readers. But one of the things they talked about at great length was that it was just really important that they have books that acknowledge the actual modern day lives and communities and issues that teens now are facing and dealing with. So you can get into these discussion. You can get into these discussions about, you know, whether it's okay to have a teenager have a glass of wine with dinner. But just not long ago, well, back when we could still go to our libraries, I picked up this book off the new YA shelf, and the story was about a girl who'd been kidnapped, raped, tortured, and then her captor committed suicide in front of her. So it's really a whole huge range, and there just don't seem to really be any rules about what maybe you can and can't talk about. But it's come along with this great surge of books with heroes and heroines and villains that are of all ethnicities and sexual orientation, and they talk about disabilities and poverty and immigration and mental illness. And I mean, it's marvelous, this wonderful array of things that really seriously address these issues that more and more teens are dealing with. Opulence is not one of those kinds of novels. I don't have that kind of experience, so I stuck with something that a kind of a community or experience that I personally knew something about, so I felt like I could address it, you know, with some validity or some truth. And so all I can say is, you know, this was the story I had to tell, so this was the story I told. I'm not a huge fan of C.S. Lewis, but I do really like this quote that's on the bottom of the slide about a children's story which is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story. And I remember when I was little, I was 4 or 5, and my mother was reading the Winnie the Pooh stories to me, and there'd be times when she'd be laughing so hard she couldn't keep reading, which of course I thought was hysterically funny. But, you know, there I am, I'm 5, she's 25, and we're both just totally loving these stories. And that feels like something that I would aspire to, would be to write something that would not just be for one kind of an audience, but would cross over those kinds of lines and not be geared to a particular market or demographic. And then there are these writers who I really admire. They're listed in no particular order. I didn't go out deliberately searching for middle grade YA novels to read as part of my research or anything. These are just writers that I've run across, read good things about, had heard good things about. I've read a lot of their books, and I really think they're marvelous. And they do all address pretty serious issues, life issues. But there's a certain gentleness about all of them, or a tenderness, where, you know, they all acknowledge life can be really hard, it can be really awful, it can be tragic, but there is a way through, and there will be joy in different places, maybe when you least expect it. And I really like that approach, because when you're a teenager, as I recall for myself anyway, that how you felt at any given moment or on any given day seemed like that was the way you were going to feel for the rest of your life, because you don't have the experience and the perspective to understand that it won't. And so I think these books like this are really good and offer some reassurance and hope for a difficult period in kids' lives. And I think that's really admirable and something I would take as a model. So that's about the YA piece. One of the talks that we had in District 6 was from Christine Fell, and she gave this great presentation on her trip to Cuba, where she was doing research for the setting of the novel that she was working on. I didn't do anything nearly that exciting and exotic, but I did do some. I made up most of it, but you do want to have details that make your scenes convincing or the story convincing. So, you know, thank goodness for online. for the Gold Coast condo that Katie lives in at the beginning of the story, I went on to realtor.com and I specified a region in Chicago, and I looked at all these photographs of penthouses and skyscrapers and went, wow, I mean, people really live like this. The watches I talked about a little bit. There's, again, another theme of a watch that Katie's been given by her father. It's a Rolex. I don't know what a Rolex looks like, so I went online, and you can find lots of pictures and descriptions, and even how to spot counterfeits, which is an incident that had some relevance there. Katie's dad has a Porsche SUV in the story. I didn't even know Porsche made an SUV. But as I say, I work in a hospital, and I walk through the physician's parking lot every day on my way into my office. And sure enough, Porsche makes an SUV, and it just seemed like this combination of a, expensive German sports car and a lumbering SUV that just felt like it had the right kind of pretentiousness and expensiveness that was appropriate for her dad. The Ellenwood tunnels I talked about, again, I went online, I found photographs and history and descriptions of it and so on. The Cozy Inn billboards, I found a couple of photographs of that to see what it might look like. I actually, before I wrote the novel, before I finished it, I never actually went to any of those places and preferred to kind of imagine them beyond what few photos I could find of them. I have since been to the Cozy Inn in Salina, and the burgers are incredibly fabulous, and it's just this absolutely delightful little place. I sent a copy of it to the owner. I sent a copy of Opulence to the owner because I thought he might get a kick out of having his shop be in a novel. And I pretty much made up all the rest of it. One thing I was a little nervous about was Jim Potter, our president in District 6, is a career law enforcement officer, and a couple of the early chapters of the novel involve the police investigating what has happened with Katie's dad. And Jim said I didn't screw anything up too badly. I tried not to stay too deep in the weeds, and I've read a lot of police procedurals, but I was very happy that Jim said that I didn't make any egregious errors in describing that. So that was kind of the research, such as it was, as I did. How I actually go about writing. People always ask authors, how do you write? And I always love it when they give the answers. I think there's this sort of wishful idea that if you just sit at the right kind of a desk at the right time of day and you use the right kind of pen and you have the right kind of view out your window, that you're going to magically, that's going to, help you write with a capital W. I'm not like that. I actually do most of my writing in bed. It's what I do when I go to bed at night, and how I help myself fall asleep is I start to imagine and picture and write scenes, and I spend hours and hours doing it. And then at very long intervals, I will get out and sit down at my laptop and I will write a scene. And then that night I go back to bed and there's more perseverating until midnight. And it takes me a very long time, but that's pretty much how I do the head work. And this little cartoon gives you some kind of an idea of all the little random thoughts that pop into my head about how old is Travis's dad and what make and model of watch does she have, and so on and so forth. I made a big spreadsheet of the dates of the family and their births and marriages and when they came on the scene and so on, so that I would keep the storyline timeline straight. So that's the kind of thing that goes on in my head for a very long time, with intervals of actually writing, which, as you all know, at some point it feels like some days you just sit down and something just happens and it flows and things happen that you didn't expect to happen. And who knows how that works, but that's just part of the magic of the whole process. And so that's just what happened over the course of a very long time. And finally, I wrote the end and buffed it up and went through it, and I had a story, and I had this manuscript, and now what was I going to do with it? So the first thing I thought was, this is a small novel about a teenage girl set in central Kansas, and I didn't really think that agents in the big 5 publishing companies in New York City were going to be beating down my door for it. So I thought that I should start by looking for a regional press that had a particular focus on the Midwest or in Kansas that might be more receptive to a story like this. So I called up my friend Google and I typed in Independent Presses Kansas. And one of the links was the Poets and Writers website that has a directory of small presses. So I just did a search. I just typed in the word Kansas to see what would come up. And the very first hit was Meadowlark Books. And so I looked up Meadowlark Books and I went to the website and looked it over. And I really liked the look of the other books that they'd already published. And I figured that with a Kansas situation, a Kansas focus, that there might be a market and a readership in place that might really be interested in the book that I'd just written. So I followed all the rules and I submitted the manuscript during the reading period. And after the reading period closed, Tracy posted on Facebook about, that the reading period was closed and she received these incredible manuscripts and they were all so wonderful. And she wished she could publish them all and she didn't know how she was going to be able to pick. And she was just really excited about basically everything that she'd gotten. And I thought, okay, well, never mind. It was a good shot. It was a good choice, and but we'll go on from there. And then she accepted it, and I was so thrilled because it was, the first place I'd sent it, and it seemed like a good fit, and I was just like really excited that she wanted to publish it. And then you start into, and probably many of you have already been through this process, then you start with the editing and the copy editing and the proofreading. And I do want to take a moment to thank Hazel Hart, who did the copy editing on Opulence. And she was so wonderful, and I really had my eyes opened on the subject of action tags, which I had never heard of, and I still don't know how anybody really learns what action tags are and how they work, but now I do because she explained it. And after about 50 corrections in the manuscript, she would just write in the margin, "You know what to do here," and I did, and I do now, so I want to thank Hazel for that because that was very enlightening. And then there was, more and more proofreading. And of course you go through the phase of, God, this is a stupid book and I'm so tired of this and nobody's ever going to want to read it. And why am I doing this? And oh my God, how did I not notice that I changed a character's name in the middle of the manuscript? So that's a bit of a slog, but we got through it. And then once we sort of got all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed, we started to talk about a few other things. Where there was some additional discussion on some sensitive issues that came up. And Tracy and I had these lengthy email exchanges about a couple of things that take place in the book, alcohol and profanity. So there's a scene in the book where Katie's Aunt Maggie pours her a glass of wine at the dinner table after she's had a really bad and painful day. And Tracy pointed out that there could be some pushback about basically, her serving alcohol to a minor. Katie is almost 16 in the course of the story. And that's a fair enough observation. But teens do drink, and we know this. And of course, it can lead to all kinds of bad things, poor judgment and dangerous activity, but it does happen. And I didn't want to ignore it or pretend it didn't happen. And I certainly wasn't going to, use it as some kind of a moralizing example of how it inevitably leads to dying in the gutter. So we talked about it, and Tracy and I went off and we talked to other writers and other readers and youth readers and so on. And I wrote an alternative version of the scene, which the wine is still in there, but it's kind of downplayed and minimized a little bit. One writer friend of mine said, it's not like she went out and did lines of cocaine. So And I thought, my idea was that this particular incident takes place, she is at home with caring, responsible adults, it's at a meal, and it just seemed like it fit with just part of that whole coming of age thing that, you know, teens are confronted with these situations and have to decide how to deal with them. And we decided we'd leave the scene as I'd originally written it. The other issue that we talked about was, I freely acknowledge, my perhaps too freehand with profanity. I can't even claim that I did it on purpose. I read that Norman Mailer said that he had a character say shit 20 times in a story because he knew his editors would take out at least half of them and then leave him with the ones that he felt were really absolutely essential. And I can't say I had any kind of forethought like that. But Tracy, again, suggested wisely that, you know, rough language in excess would filter out some maybe younger readers for whom this story might otherwise be appropriate or interesting. So again, we went off and we talked to colleagues and friends and readers, and my Facebook community was actually pretty funny on the subject. One person said, you know, have you ever even spent any time in a middle school library or middle school playground and heard how those kids talk? This is, you know, this is just how it is. And the writer Mary Doria Russell said to me, heavens to Betsy, stick to your guns, which made me laugh. But I did scour through the manuscript, and I weighed it all with a little more judiciousness than I had before. I took out a number of F-bombs. There weren't many, but a handful, and I took out several of them. There were a few, though, that there were situations in which, you know, euphemisms were just not going to make it for the topic of that conversation. And so I left those in. I think I struck a pretty good balance of, you know, not sanitizing, not sugarcoating, and just trying to be fair about, you know, how kids talk, how people talk in particular situations, and just to try to be honest about it. And I think it worked out pretty well. Fun thing we did with the formatting. There are a number of text messages exchanged in the course of the novel, and when I originally wrote it, I drafted just as sort of an italicized dialogue format. And after Tracy had put together, you know, one of the first galleys, I discovered online they have these fake text message generators where you can create a fake text message and it generates this little image that looks just like what you would see on your phone. And we could drop those into the story. And I thought that was kind of fun. It gave it a little graphical pop and a little relief from the text, and acknowledged how much teens certainly, and the rest of us too, rely on text messaging these days. But that was kind of a cool thing that we discovered in process that was kind of fun. And after all that, finally, we had this wonderful little object of a book, which I was so proud of. I wanted to talk a little bit about the cover. I love this cover so much. The librarian's presentation that I mentioned earlier about the YA books, they in their talk, they displayed lots and lots of covers of these books, and it was amazing to me how they all looked alike. I mean, there was a certain style and a certain look that they basically all used, and you couldn't tell one from the other. And I was sort of validated about this last week. The Washington Post had a piece about book covers, and the author of this column set these book covers up side by side, and there were certain styles that were just used over and over and over again. And I really wanted something that was going to be unique and special and reflect the setting of the story and be visually really lovely. And a friend of mine in Great Bend, Jay Miller, who is a fabulous photographer, let me come over to his house, and I clicked through his files of just dozens and dozens and dozens of these gorgeous landscape photos that he takes. And I picked out a bunch of them and sent them to Tracy. And once again, you know, we showed them to our friends and neighbors and family and what have you. And we finally narrowed it down to this one. And then Tracy did, you know, the layout of fitting it onto the book cover and the font that we chose, and she did all of that hard work. And we came up with something that I think is just really stunning. And I just love it every time I look at it. I paid Jay for it. He charged me a modest one-time fee for the rights and permission to use that. He still owns the copyright on the photo, but I have the official permission to use it as a book cover. And then he's shared this around with his friends and connections and so on. So it's a little PR for him to have his photo on a book cover. So that was something I'm really proud of. So that's how it turned into this lovely little object. One of the other things I did before publication was I went ahead and officially filed for copyright on it. In my job, I've been kind of the copyright maven for a number of years, but it's always been from the other side where I have people come to me and say, hey, I want to use this image or I want to copy this table for a presentation I'm doing. Is that okay? I've never been on the rights holder's side, so I decided this would be a learning experience. And you do not have to officially register your work for copyright. The law is written so that, once you hit save, it's yours and it's protected and it belongs to you. So you don't have to actually do this. However, if someone does misuse or steal your work without permission, apparently it allows you to sue them for more money if that's what you're going to do. But it just seemed like sort of a professional thing to do, and it's not hard. And so I thought I would just go ahead and go through the process. So if you want to do that, you go to this site, copyright.gov/registration. And if you like Google copyright registration, you'll get all these .com sites where they'll do all the filing for you, but then they charge you like an extra $30, and you do not need to do that. So just go straight to the copyright.gov, and there's very clear instructions. You upload a digital copy of your text and the cover. It took me like 15 minutes, and it's not even that expensive if you do it pre-publication. So I just went through the process, and I thought that was a good thing to learn about. One thing I did learn in the course of doing that is when you do register it and you have to put in all your contact information and so on, all of that information will be publicly accessible in the database that they keep of copyrighted works. So if you don't want your email or your home address or something that's in that public database, then you might want to consider using, a separate email account or a post office box or something like that. But that's it. That's all there was to the copywriting bit. Marketing. This is the hardest part for me. Have not been through this process before. And then, of course, it all happens with the pandemic and the bookstores closing and the libraries closing. And so this has been really a challenge. I went to a talk a few years ago about being a good literary citizen, though. And that was really helpful to me as someone who is new and trying to break into this world. I went to this conference, and they just said, here are some simple things you can do to just be a contributing member of the community and make connections and get your name out there. So I don't Twitter. I drew the line at Twitter. I logged on twice and tried it, and it was just awful. I just said, no, I am not tweeting. But yes, I have a Facebook page, and I follow writers that I like on their Facebook pages, and I follow local bookstores and writers groups. And there's the Friday Reads Facebook page where they just ask people to chime in every Friday. What are you reading this week? And so I do that every week, just a sentence or two, what book you're reading. Goodreads has been a lot of fun. I am signed up as a Goodreads author, and I contribute a lot of book reviews there. It's a lot of fun. I mean, it's just reading and writing and chatting with other people about reading and writing, and that's been very enjoyable. I did create a website. That was a whole nother challenge, but I did it. So yes, there is one place where all the information about me and my writing and how to contact me is all in one place, and that's very creatively just juliestielstra.com. Tracy has done an amazing amount of work with sending out review copies and sending out press releases. got a wonderful review in the Emporia Gazette, which was delightful. As a librarian, I've been sort of trying to work the library channels, and that really works rather differently. Press releases and cold emails really don't work very well with librarians because they have limited budgets and they have to buy so many different kinds of things for, all kinds of readers. And they are really hooked into the really established book review sources, like the Kirkus Review and Library Journal and Book List, and those are just really hard to get into. There are other review sources out there where if you pay them what seems to me a really large amount of money, like $400, they will promise to write a review of your book. I'm really not comfortable with that. I'm not really going to go there, but the libraries do depend a lot on those kinds of resources, and so that's a little harder to crack. Hopefully, as things begin to reopen a little bit, maybe some of these other opportunities of signings and book talks and things will open up. And of course, we're all finding all kinds of new openings with this kind of thing we're doing today. So, and conferences that are going online, and maybe this will open up some new opportunities. I am very proud, though, that the Kansas State Library had a way that you could ask them to buy a book for their online collection, and they put Opulence in it after I asked them to. And anybody in Kansas can get a card from their local library, and with their library card, they can log into the yourcloudlibrary.com Kansas site, and it's available there in e-format to be downloaded. And it is also available on some of the platforms that libraries buy, Overdrive, Media on Demand. It is available to libraries, so it's there. It's just a little bit harder to get to that person who actually makes the decision title by title, but we're working on it. For anyone who has already bought a copy of Opulence or who would like to buy a copy of Opulence, if you would like a signed copy, we can't obviously do the in-person signings, but again, Tracy created these very nice stickers, and if you would like a book plate to stick in your copy, let us know. You can send me a chat while we're here today if you want. You can go to my website, juliestielstra.com, click on my writing and then on Opulence, and there's a little form at the bottom of the page where you can just request a signed book plate, and we will get one for you and send it to you, and you can stick it in your book, and then you have an autographed copy. I love autographed copies. I was absolutely thrilled when I pre-ordered months and months and months ago Hilary Mantel's final version of her Thomas Cromwell trilogy, and I pre-ordered it, and then after months and months of waiting, I went and picked it up and discovered it was signed by her. I was so excited. So some people value that. So that's pretty much the process that I went through with Opulence, and just to let you know what else I've been up to. Julie Sellers, I know you're in on this. I thought this was really cool that we had two Julies from Kansas who had essays included in The Magic of Dogs, the anthology that just came out from the Chicken Soup for the Soul people. That came out in July and is widely available basically anywhere you can buy books. You can get this. I have a little essay about my Italian Greyhound William, who went blind at a young age and lived most of his life that way. And I just wrote a little essay about what that meant to me and how he coped and how brave and gallant he was. So that's out already. Sometime later this fall, I have a short story that will be included in Zizzle Literary, which is an anthology. They have a series of anthologies, and they gear, again, this is that cross-generational thing that I just love, of stories that kids and their families can read together and share, and that hopefully they will all enjoy. I wrote a little sort of fairy tale ripoff on The Beauty and the Beast, which is always one of my favorite fairy tales, but I never really liked the ending, so I wrote another version with an ending I liked a little bit better. So that will be due out in the fall. We're not sure exactly when the book is actually produced in Hong Kong, and given the unsettled times in Hong Kong, I don't know how that's affecting. They just did release another anthology this month, so hopefully they're still on track, but I'm looking forward to that. It's a gorgeous hardcover volume. The illustrations are to die for, and I'm just really thrilled to have been part of that. And many of you know about Blue Cedar Press, Gretchen Ike. Her Death Project anthology is coming out very soon, and I have an essay in there. This is a theme of stories and essays and poems on the general theme of death, which sort of comes along with these difficult times and people confronting it that never thought they would have to so soon. The content is amazing. I've looked at the proofs, and there's just such wonderful writing in there, and from many of the people who are in the Kansas Authors Club. Maybe some of you are here today. But a couple years ago, I made a trip to Assisi to leave some ashes. I'd always wanted to make a pilgrimage to St. Francis's tomb, and I did, and it was just a really deeply emotional experience, and I wrote an essay about it, and that will be in that anthology. I would encourage you to buy one, just because all the proceeds are going to Doctors Without Borders, which is just a wonderful group that does amazing work, and I couldn't respect or admire them more. So I would encourage you to look out for that. That's the stuff that's in the pipeline right now. Am I working on anything now? Yeah, kind of. I just finished a draft of a sort of fantasy fairy tale novel called The Wasp Queen, and just finished the first draft. So it's a long way to go before I do anything with it, but that was fun to write. And I'm just now sort of dabbling with the idea of a historical novel. One of my other fascinations is with the First World War. I've read a lot about it. And I discovered that Fort Leavenworth in Kansas was where they housed many of the imprisoned conscientious objectors, and that's a pretty dramatic story. At the time, during the First World War, there was an episode of night riders who rode their horses through the streets of Ellenwood, scattering leaflets saying, "You dirty German traitors, we are coming for you," which was pretty frightening. And at the same time, we have the women's temperance movement and the women's suffrage movement, which, again, there's some prominent Kansas involvement there. And I thought, wow, that would really make an interesting novel. I'm just sort of toying with the idea. I know there's a huge amount of serious research to be done on that, but I've sort of got that on my horizon. A couple of people have asked me if I'm considering a sequel to Opulence, Kansas, and I'm sorry, but the answer to that is no. I loved writing it. I really cared a lot about the people in it. I hope their lives turn out well. I think they will, but I am not going to be the one to write that story. I think I'm done with that. And that's pretty much what I wanted to share with you today. And let me leave you with just my thanks to everyone, for Tracy, of course, Jay, the photographer, who I mentioned, Hazel, who I mentioned. My partner, Forrest Orms, is also a writer, and so he left me alone while I was working on this, and he even told me he liked the book, and he'd never read a YA book in his entire life, so that meant a lot to me. And my household filled with animals that walk on the keyboard and bark when the mailman comes and things like that. So that's my support team. I would also just say that I dedicated Opulence, Kansas to Leo and Teresa Feist, people who built our house. They are buried in the churchyard behind that church that had its steeple blown off, so I have visited their graves. Next to them, they have the graves of their infant daughter and another daughter who died at the age of 23. So, boy, there was some heartache there, and I'm just really grateful to them for house, and I hope they understand that somewhere. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for inviting me and listening to me and putting up with my technological glitches. And thank you so very much. And if you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear them. We're back.
Has anybody, any kid living on the Gold Coast read your story and responded to how well or not you portrayed downtown Chicago?
The short answer to that is no, they haven't. I was very pleased at the Kansans who read the story, and of course most of the focus of the story is there, who made some nice comments about feeling like they recognized the places I was describing, or it felt really, really true. But no. Oh, I see somebody's kitty. Mine are locked out of the bedroom. But no Gold Coast involvement there.
My daughter lives north of there. She teaches at Loyola, so she would.
Okay.
I was thinking, you know, what happens?
Okay, well, maybe she'd like to read it. Then she could give me some feedback.
Julie, where did the name Opulence come from?
I was thinking about the history of that small the British enclave and their ideas of that they're in the middle of this desolate prairie. They were going to have opera houses and fox hunting and things like that. And I just sort of like the word, and it just struck me as a good name for the town that fit part of its history that maybe would go along with that. And it was also a little nod to the place that Katie comes from at the beginning, of the Gold Coast condo and the wealthy family and the private school, and then how she gets dropped out of that and finds a different kind of opulence in a different place.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask?
Well, yes. If someone is driving around down there, can they follow your geography and find the site of Opulence?
Well, opulence doesn't exist.
I know, but
yeah.
I have made up a town, and somebody would be able to follow that geography and find where that town is. So
I leave it deliberately vague, I do model it quite a bit on Ellenwood, which just is what I'm familiar with. And I like to tell people that when they ask where in Kansas our house is, I say, well, Kansas is a rectangle, and if you draw an X corner to corner, our house is 4 miles west of where the X crosses.
That's good.
And they sort of go, oh, okay. But yeah, I mean, Ellenwood is probably the basic model of it, and then I added ingredients. But yes, it's very central, but I deliberately leave the actual location pretty vague.
I just love that title. The title and the cover, and because I wasn't going to listen in today, and I just thought, I looked at the cover and the title, and I thought, I just hear it.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. That the cover and that title have done their jobs. I'm thrilled.
I just said I want to order a couple for grandkids because it's so interesting sounding. Thank you.
Well, I would love to hear if they have any feedback. Did they like it? Did they think it was realistic? You know, I mean, here I am, you know, this 60+ person writing as though I know what teenagers do, but I was a little nervous about that, frankly. But, you know, I don't know what the slang is, or, you know, what their fashion choices are particularly. And, but I heard John Green interviewed on the radio some time ago, who wrote The Fault in Our Stars and Turtles All the Way Down, who's tremendously successful, and teenagers just can't get enough of him. And the interviewer asked him about that, and he said, you know, I was sort of this nerdy outsider kid, and when I was a teenager, I didn't know what the cool slang was, or, anything. And so he said, I'm just gonna not worry about that and just try to write about the human aspects and the emotions and let the chips fall where they may. And obviously it worked for him. So I thought, well, I'm not going to agonize over that too much and just do the best I can and draw on my own memories and experiences. And but I would be very interested to hear what grandchildren or other young readers might say. I know Tracy gave it to her daughter and she was nice about it. She liked it. So.
Mhm.
I should, oh, that's interesting what that does. It gets hidden in the book is here. It is available anywhere you buy books. So if you have a favorite independent bookstore, you can order it through them. They should be able to order it with no problem. If you like the big online stores, you can do that. If you want to order it directly from Meadowlark, you can do that. Our goal is to make it convenient for you to pick it up anywhere you like. And of course, if you want to request your library order it, that would be wonderful for us too. We're easy to please. And of course, we can get you a signed book plate as well if you'd like that.
Absolutely.
So.
I would like to thank her for writing about this wonderful state and seeing the beauty in our state. We too often, we have an interesting history and an interesting geography and an interesting set of people that we just
Absolutely.
need to, as Kansas writers, be writing about those things. So thank you for writing about my wonderful state.
Well, I fell in love with it too. So, and there's part of me that just says, oh, I don't want people to know how wonderful it is because I don't want them all moving here. We like it this way. But yeah, I'm glad you appreciated that because that was certainly a major motivator for me to say, wow, this is a really amazing place. And the history, just as I said, talking about looking at some of these things in this historical novel I'm like, I didn't know that Kansas gave women the full right to vote in 1912, years before it was national. And that was pretty amazing. So yeah, it's fascinating.
I definitely love your cover too, and the title, Opulence. And I think living here all our lives, we take Kansas for granted. And we take the beauty of the Flint Hills and then the plains.
Oh, so beautiful.
And the sunsets that are just amazing. I read an article from a National Geographic photographer who said Kansas is the place nobody knows about. And he said they have among the top 10 most beautiful sunsets in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I believe that.
So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good presentation.
My sister lives in Oregon now, Eastern Oregon, and with the fires in California, she's now getting beautiful sunsets.
Oh, yeah.
Ashes out there. Normally she doesn't. So,
Yeah, I remember when Mount St. Helen blew up years ago, and I was in library school at the time, and so I could, the sunsets in Arizona where I was were amazing. And the weather guy on TV said the same thing, that it's from the ash spew into the atmosphere that was creating all these layers and colors. And that was pretty extraordinary. Yeah.
While I have some of you still here, I just want to remind people that registration for the convention is ongoing, and if you register before the end of day Tuesday, September 1st, you can still get in for the early bird discount. If you have friends that are not members, they can join with registration and still get that discounted rate. They can actually become a member and register at the same time at the same link.
Tracy, can you tell us something about the format of the conference? I mean, will it be like this kind of Zoom meetings?
It will be a combination of Zoom meetings and webinars. So depending on, we do have a few of our speakers who are also pre-recording, just a couple of them. but depending on what type of workshop or speech it is, there'll be either a webinar, which is basically, I think my understanding is where the speaker is the main screen and everyone is just tuned in listening, or there'll be meeting formats like this. And we should be getting that schedule, at least a preliminary version of it, ready to share, I would say within the next couple of weeks. Carol Yoho is working on getting all the speakers in their slots. And we've got, well, Dwayne and I and
Hopefully
Carol.
before the end of next week.
Yeah,
Within the next 5-6 days.
Well, I guess while I have you here, I'll go ahead and talk about a few other things I'd like people to know about the convention. We are working on a virtual book room, which hopefully you saw a bit about in the invitation. But that was one of the things we struggled with. How do we replace the book room experience when we're having the virtual convention? We have come up with a site issue. It's ISSUU. And so our idea is if everyone puts samples of their books, please don't load your whole book there because that makes it available to the public. But if you go to that site and look at Kansas Authors Club, the links are in the invitation. You can see some examples of what people are doing. But you can put a sample of your book there. You can put links in it to anywhere you want. You can link it to your website. You can link it to Amazon or wherever the book is sold. And we thought that might be a good way to get people to participate in that book room experience. And once people start sharing those with us, we'll make that part of our social media presence and find ways to promote that during the convention as well.
Okay, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I have this little button up here that says recording, and I'm assuming that means we're live. But are you recording this session? And have you considered recording the sessions at the conference? Because to me, one of the advantages of a virtual is if you have recordings that are available for maybe a month or whatever, I don't have to choose between two that I want to go to.
Yeah, all of the, I am recording, first of all, and this is a sample so that I can practice loading it, and I'm trying to work out all the kinks for the convention. But yes, we are recording the sessions. Everyone who registers will have 3 months to view all of the workshops, except for the workshops that are sponsored by Kansas Humanities Council. Part of our deal with them is that those workshops will only be available for 1 week. But we will make sure that they're flagged so people will know they need to watch those first. But yeah, so you can watch the conference live, you can participate that weekend, but if for some reason you can't, or if you can only attend part of it, it will be available.
Thank you.
Watch.
Love that. Thank you.
You can watch it 2 or 3 times.
Interesting, but I've got to take off.
Thanks, George. Thanks for joining us.
Can I put in a pitch that might help Julie?
Sure.
Our lovely bookstore in Hutchinson, Bluebird Books, was one of the fatalities of the coronavirus. But in the last week, we have a new bookstore taking their place, and I think it's called Crow's Nest, CROWES. And if hopefully Julie's book will be there. If not, I'm sure they would love to talk to her.
That's a good note. Thank you for letting us know that.
Yes. I'm not sure it's Crow's Nest, but I know Crow's is the first place.
Okay. Well, I thank you everyone for joining us. Did everyone was it easy to get into the meeting?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no trouble.
Great. That's good to hear.
Nice to meet you all again.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right. We'll be in
Nice
touch
to see you.
for more. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Really, thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Dwayne.
Oh, goodbye, Dwayne. Yes.